Hey, welcome everyone to this month's From the Field. I'm Brittany with the Idaho Wheat Commission, and we are here today with Shelby Nicely from U.S. Wheat Associates. She's the Director of Trade Policy. I'm going to let her introduce herself, but first I just want to remind you that anyone is welcome to ask questions of Shelby. You can unmute your microphone to do that, and we will notice and give you a call out to go ahead and ask your question. You can raise your hand using the buttons at the bottom of your screen, or you can type it into the chat and we will ask for you. So don't be shy about that. She's happy to answer questions. All right, Shelby, go ahead and introduce yourself. Tell us about your background maybe a little bit and what you do with U.S. Wheat.
Sure. Thank you, Brittany, for the introduction. As she said, I'm Shelby Nicely. I'm the Director of Trade Policy at U.S. Wheat Associates in Arlington, Virginia. And I guess a little background, I say that I'm an economist by training. I went to school at Texas Tech and I studied ag economics. And then through various roles, made my way to DC and ended up in wheat. And then I worked on various policy issues and then came back to working on the topic of wheat at U.S. Wheat Associates about 2.5 years ago. So happy to be here.
All right, thank you. Can you explain the food aid program to us, and what is U.S. Wheat's partnership with USDA and USAID? What do those organizations do with food aid?
Sure. So food aid is used differently by USDA and USAID. USDA's FAS has a program called Food for Progress, and they purchase commodities that are then monetized in a priority country to aid agricultural development programs. And these programs are typically ran by an NGO, but sometimes they can be a government-to-government program, like we saw like a year and a half ago for Sudan. With USDA, we do have a good relationship with them. And, we do keep open communication with them on projects and programs and how to monetize, the specs and whatnot in countries that they might be sending commodities to. For USAID, they have a Food for Peace program that is an emergency feeding program, and most of those commodities are being sent to countries that are the most food insecure. Currently under that program, most of the wheat being donated or being purchased from the U.S. is going to Yemen and Ethiopia. And then also under the Food for Peace, USAID does send cash and vouchers, and this makes up at this point more than half of their donations. So those funds are greater than what we're seeing in commodities these days.
So when you say that they are monetized, can you explain that to us a little bit? What does that mean?
Yeah, so basically when it's monetized, the product is still being purchased like a commercial sale and then sent to that country. So for example, if it was going to Colombia, and then there they are going to sell it, and the funds that are received from that sale of wheat or those sales go to fund a project in that any type of ag development program in that country. So that's where the NGO piece comes into play. So the NGO will implement the program. So if whatever country they're in, if they're okay, we want to we have projects to improve the water supply or something like that, then the funds from those monetized wheat or other commodities under these food aid programs under the FAS will go to fund those things, if that makes sense.
Okay, so they would purchase the wheat regular through the market.
Yes.
And then that money is used for those projects. It's not always that they're sending specifically wheat to those countries, right?
Right. It could be a variety of things. So USDA will prioritize which countries they want to focus on for their Food for Progress program, and then they choose a list of commodities to sell to that country. So for example, Colombia was a priority country for a project. They chose to send wheat there. And so then the wheat is then on just a general market sale is sold to Colombia, and then inside of like Colombia, that product would be sold to whomever they are sending it to, if it's millers or whatnot. And then the funds from that go to the program, the project, whatever it might be. This one's not specifically like a water program. I'm just like giving an example.
Okay. So how much wheat has been donated through the food aid program or monetized through the food aid program in the past 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, so over the past 5 marketing years, we have seen food aid donations average around 970,000 metric tons. And then these last 2 years, we have seen over 1 million metric tons of wheat under both programs, USDA or USAID. Again, most of that is being sent to Ethiopia and Yemen and Sudan for these past 2 years. There was a big Food for Progress program that was Alta Sudan, and that was of wheat. So what might be interesting for a lot of y'all to know is that Ethiopia is going to receive mostly hard red winter wheat. Then Yemen is getting a lot of that soft wheat, which I think that y'all care a lot about. The Sudan program received hard red winter, and that was a little different. That was a government to government program. So I talked about that a little bit. You either have a government to government program or an NGO. So that one was more of a political agreement, and that was never finished. So they agreed to send 300,000 metric tons of hard red winter wheat to Sudan. The last about 50,000 metric tons was never sent due to some political challenges in Sudan. So that at this time has never been completed, and it's probably been about 2 years now.
Okay.
Hard to know if it will be finished, but
if only we had crystal balls for these things, right?
okay.
So do you anticipate an increase in food aid this year with the crisis in Ukraine? How has the war there affected these programs? Or what do you anticipate seeing?
Sure. Yeah. So I definitely don't forecast those things, but I will say this year the U.S. of course has sent, especially the past 2 years, a lot more wheat to these countries. And with the current crisis going on right now, the U.S. did release funds from the Bill Emerson Humanitarian Trust to help offset some of the lost wheat supplies from the Ukraine during this challenging time. The Bill Emerson Humanitarian Trust is a set of funds that is put aside that cannot be used until there's an extreme emergency facing the world, impacting food supplies, food security. And so we saw that a few months ago, USDA and USAID got together and made the decision to release those funds. So the funding from that will basically purchase U.S. commodities to send abroad under the USAID Food for Peace program. So that's as I said at the beginning, that is an emergency feeding program. So those funds will be helpful there.
Okay. And you had mentioned Yemen and the Sudan. Are those countries that would normally purchase their wheat from the Black Sea?
I would have to double check. I do not remember that off the top of my head. Which ones they would typically buy from. I know that there's some stuff, the US does send some to Yemen. And I don't know off the top of my head what Sudan typically buys. I can follow up though. I used to know all those things right at the top of my head, like real quick, who went where. Right now I can't remember.
You weren't expecting that, sorry.
I was not expecting that question.
So how is the donated wheat sourced? Is it direct from farmers? Do you buy it through the regular market? How is that procured to send overseas?
Yes, so the wheat is purchased at market value for these various food programs, just like a typical wheat sale for export.
Okay. And does donating these large quantities of wheat to food insecure countries, does it affect the markets? How does it affect the markets if it does?
No, so food aid programs or food aid donations must not disrupt commercial sales whenever they decide we're wherever they're going to send the commodities. So it must not disrupt commercial sales.
Okay. And how do the higher wheat prices affect food donations?
I'm so sorry. I think you cut out.
Oh, sorry. How do the higher food prices that we're seeing, the higher commodity prices, affect those donations?
I think I only caught part of what you're saying. It still kept cutting out. But I think that with the release of the Bill Emerson Humanitarian Trust Funds, that'll help with any increased cost of commodities at this time. So maybe they can get more out to those most in need. So that's kind of a part of the reason why they released that, right? We had like a shortage of supplies and a lot of areas are needing food at this time. And so that was the way the program was designed, is to tap into that whenever there's a crisis.
Okay. How do you determine what classes of wheat are sent to different countries?
Yeah, so the way that is determined is a few different factors, but classes of wheat are determined based on availability here in the US. And then the other piece of that is consumer preference in that country that's going to be receiving the commodities. As you know, like all these countries are different, so they have different tastes and preferences on how they consume a wheat-based product. And so different classes of wheat give you a different type of product. So they do try to meet the needs of that country.
Okay. And I know that US Wheat provides education to millers and bakers on end-use qualities of specific classes of wheat, soft white wheat, for example. Are there similar educational programs or opportunities provided to the end users in countries that receive wheat through food aid?
Yeah, so the countries that are receiving this food assistance, at times they might receive some type of training on how to use the wheat that's being sent under these programs. And US Wheat works to provide any assistance where that makes sense and is practical. But unfortunately, in like some of these countries that we're talking about that are receiving this food aid, it's not the safest place to travel. So like Yemen, they're currently facing a war there, so it's not a place that you would want to be traveling. So that is something that is part of it. And then the other part is we might see a little bit more of this in Food for Progress programs. So that's the USDA programs. And those recipients might see a little bit more training than maybe some of these USAID programs, which are emergency feeding. But USDA does try to provide as much education as possible and in a safe way. So.
Okay. And we have a question in the chat. Is there a difference in quality of wheat used in food aid versus what is sold commercially?
So the sales are done just like a commercial sale, but the specs are whatever that buyer is wanting for that country. So a lot of times you'll see maybe a different dockage than in some commercial sales.
Okay.
I don't know if that answers the question.
I think so. Do you have a follow-up, Matthew? All right. So Shelby, if food aid was its own market, like Mexico or the Philippines, how much of the market would it account for? Like 2%, 5%, how much?
I'm checking because I don't remember these numbers off the top of my head. How much the US imports from there?
Yes.
Or excuse me, how much they import from the US? So and your question was on Yemen, right? So Yemen's the US supplies about 16% of their market. And that's why I was looking this up, because I was going to follow up with the other question. So Russia is the main supplier to Yemen, followed by Australia, then the US.
Okay. So
I wanted to check. I was going to check. I just didn't know off my head.
Sure. So overall, is the food aid if food aid was its own country, for example, where would it fall in the spectrum of how much of U.S. wheat is being exported through food aid channels?
Sure,
Does
yeah.
that question make sense? Did I ask that?
Yes, I know what you're asking.
Okay.
So there's some years that the total amount of wheat being sent under food aid programs from the United States can be, it has been at times, if it was all clumped together as one value, would represent a top 10 country if it were a country, right? So it's pretty large and pretty significant at times. So it's definitely important to, food aid is very important to our farmers. That's a large market.
Are there examples of countries who once received food aid and now purchase U.S. wheat on the open market?
Yeah, so there's one in particular that you'll see a lot of in case studies and whatnot if you do some reading out there. But South Korea was once a large recipient of food aid and I believe other types of aid, and they are now a high value market for the U.S. And South Korea does import high quality wheats from, of course, the U.S. and then of course our two major competitors when we're looking at the international market, Canada and Australia as well.
Okay.
And
So, sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to jump in. Is that part of the goal, is to kind of lift them up and then also develop a market through the use of that food aid?
Not anymore. The aid is donated to aid those in need. So that's why we talk about, not just starting commercial sales and such.
So what are some of the biggest arguments or the biggest argument to continue these programs? You mentioned that it's a huge market share for U.S. wheat. Are there other reasons to continue the food aid programs?
Yeah, so I think that, going back to a couple of things that I pointed out, it can be a very large market for the U.S. at times, because the commodity is still being sold. So at the same time, it's like by selling it, our farmers are benefiting here from the sale of the wheat. That's great for the economy. And then also that product is being sent overseas to those that are hungry and need food at such a hard time. When we look at these countries that are war torn, and then also through those USDA programs where the funding is, building, ag development projects there.
Okay. All right. I'm just going to open this back up.
I see one more question,
go ahead,
Whitney. And it is, how do other wheat producing countries compare in providing food aid? Do our other major competitors have similar programs?
Can you repeat that question?
Sure. How do the other major wheat producing countries, our major competitors, for example, compare in providing food aid? Do they have similar programs?
So the U.S. is the largest supplier donator of food aid programs. Food aid.
But other countries do have similar programs, just not to the scale.
I don't know specific programs that any other countries might have.
Okay.
I just know that we are the largest.
All right. Well, does anyone else have any questions for Shelby? Just make sure that we're covered. I'd also like to mention that we're joined today by Amanda Hoey from Oregon, and also have some on here from Montana today. So welcome and thanks for joining us. If not, it looks like this was a great conversation about food aid. Shelby, thank you so much for joining us. Do you have anything that we haven't touched on that you'd like to mention or say?
No, I think that those are probably the highlights. I think unless y'all have other questions.
All right. Well, I don't see any popping up in the chat or any microphones being unmuted. So if you do have questions, you can go ahead and email those to us and we can follow up with Shelby. But thank you again for joining us, Shelby, and for all of you on the call. Or if you're listening to this later via our podcast or YouTube, thank you for tuning in, and we will see you next month.